Well, good day. Hope you guys are all doing well. And we're several weeks now into our quarantine. We're going to be talking about a different type of quarantine here in a little bit. Um, so for today, it is obviously you may not be watching this on this day, but April 16th is the day that I was assuming you would watch this. So do something on um, your notes for this that you're handing in. The assignment I gave you, put something from this day in history, April 16th, and a famous person from this day in history who was born on this day in history, April 16th. So when we left off, we had talked about John Glenn becoming the first American to orbit the Earth from outer space, and that, it did seem precarious at the end there that he may not make it back alive, but he did. And obviously, you began to see the space race take form, and Kennedy changed the finish line to landing on the moon. And it also was kind of a fight between not only the Soviet Union and the United States, but between Christianity and those who believe in God and atheists and their understanding of the world, just by the words that astronauts or cosmonauts used in their behalf. Well, let's turn our attention to some continuing tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. Uh, in 1962, it became apparent that the Soviets had 40,000 troops in Cuba. Kennedy was not happy that some of this became public as it was leaked by Republicans, he thought, in order to embarrass him. So, in the middle of his campaign trip, he was summoned back to Washington, D.C. There, he received information that the U 2 spy planes flying over Cuba noted that the Soviets were installing IRBMs, which is intermediate range ballistic missiles, there in Cuba. This meant that the Soviet Union could do a nuclear attack on the entire eastern seaboard of the United States and also many other southern states as well. Even a place like Oklahoma could have been reached by these IRBMs. Not since Pearl Harbor had America felt like it was in such grave danger of an attack. Instantly, President Kennedy summoned his top advisors to a conference. Some of his military advisors warned him to do that staging a preemptive assault on Cuba to wipe out the missiles might lead to a nuclear war. Uh, so basically, they're warning him not to do a strike against Cuba because it possibly could lead to something much worse. So he obviously rejected the option of going to full on war. But he knew the Soviet missiles could not be allowed to stay in Cuba. The Kremlin denied any knowledge of what was going on in Cuba, that they had placed any missiles there. Kennedy decided then to take it public, and he went on national television on October 22nd, 1962, to inform the American people that the United States knew of the Soviet deception and their reckless nuclear arms buildup in Cuba. And he demanded in this speech on TV that the Russians, the Soviets, remove their missiles from Cuba. Kennedy then ordered a quarantine of Cuba. Now, us being in quarantine in our houses right now, many of us, we kind of understand what that word means. But this would be a different use for the word because Kennedy avoided calling this action a blockade, because a blockade was considered an act of war by international law. Because what he really is going to do is do a blockade, which means he was going to have the United States Navy, which was very large, surround the island of Cuba and intercept any Soviet freighters that were bound for Havana, Cuba, with more missiles. But instead of calling it a blockade, he called it quarantine because he wanted to avoid going to war. So the word choice was very important here. So it was called a quarantine of Cuba. Kennedy did receive full support, primarily of the American people. The British conservative Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was also in support of Kennedy. Even France's President de Gaulle was in favor of John F. Kennedy's action here against Cuba. In a meeting in the United Nations, Ambassador Adlai Stevenson from the United States showed U-2 reconnaissance photos to the council there, and he confronted the Soviet ambassador, demanding that he tell them what was going on. Um, and the Soviet uh, representative here claimed that he had a hard time understanding the translation and didn't know what he was saying. And um, in response, Adlai Stevenson said, "I am prepared to wait, Mr. Ambassador, until hell freezes over for your answer." This was Adlai Stevenson's probably greatest moment as a politician and as a world leader, as he confronted the Soviet Union and demanded answers here at this United Nations meeting. Khrushchev offered Kennedy a quid pro quo, which means both sides would get something out of this deal. That he would remove Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange that the U.S. would remove missiles from Turkey, who was an ally of NATO. Kennedy had to reject this, at least publicly, but he did follow up with another suggestion. The United States would guarantee Cuba's territorial integrity if the Soviet Union were to remove their missiles. Meaning, at this point in time, you remember you had the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and obviously that didn't go well. However, the United States still was, fairly in support of people trying to overthrow Castro in Cuba, and he's basically saying we will agree not to back these exiles who want to overthrow Castro, and instead we will support not doing that any longer. We will no longer put our efforts towards overthrowing Castro as long as you pull your missiles out. Now, as a Soviet freighter steamed towards the United States ring of steel ships surrounding Cuba and seemed like it was going to maybe try to bring more missiles to Cuba, the two countries stand eye to eye, and Khrushchev was the first to blink, meaning he turned his freighter away. And so on October 28th, 1962, Khrushchev agreed to remove his missiles from Cuba. Castro was very angry by this, that the Soviet ally was backing down, and Castro called Khrushchev a homosexual. Interesting. Kennedy had prevailed. Now, as much as I just said, they stood eyeball to eyeball, and Khrushchev's the one who blinked and backed down. Secretly, JFK did and quietly agree to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, but that was not something that was publicized. However, what was publicized is that the Soviet Union backed down and did remove their missiles from Cuba and did no longer bring missiles to Cuba. But appearances contribute to reality. So even though technically this might have been almost a equal exchange here between the two countries in removing missiles, in public perception, the United States kind of won this standoff. Khrushchev privately now began to use the word détente with Kennedy, which is basically a general relaxation in tensions. And he okayed a new hotline, which at this point in time was a teletype machine directly between Moscow and Washington, D.C. That way, in the future, if there was any situation like this where the world was on the brink, possibly of World War III and nuclear war, each of these leaders could get in contact with each other directly. They wouldn't have to go through any systems. Eventually, they would have hotline telephones installed. That was literally a hotline from the White House to the Kremlin that would allow these leaders to communicate very clearly with each other in a quick manner. Now, this is a side note. I don't have this on here, but it is during this time period in like 1962 into 1963 that you really have the birth of the environmentalist movement in the United States and the impact of industrialization and modernization on the surroundings. So you begin to see this as a move. At first, it was a voluntary movement of individual citizens. In time, however, it would actually use legislation through the court system to try to create cleaner air and those types of things. Americans were continuing to enjoy prosperity during this time period. John F. Kennedy was generally frustrated by his attempts to get legislation passed through Congress. He pressed the Democratic-controlled Congress to cut taxes. Okay, now think about that. He was literally the first of his party, so the Democratic Party, ever to embrace the idea that cutting taxes would actually stimulate economic growth and increase government revenue. So Kennedy was the first Democrat to suggest cutting taxes would actually bring in more revenue and would actually make the economy work better. He also failed to get Medicare approved, which would be medical care for the elderly that the government would help pay for. This had been something that had been on the agenda since Teddy Roosevelt's failed Bull Moose bid in 1912, something that for a long time people had tried to pass but hadn't passed up to this point in time. He did succeed in helping create the Peace Corps. Now, this is not Greenpeace. They're totally different. Greenpeace is an environmentalist group. The Peace Corps, however, did send thousands of idealistic young Americans around the world. And during this time period especially, they helped long neglected allies of the United States in Latin America. Now, the Peace Corps didn't go fight wars typically or anything like that, but they would offer aid to these countries that maybe were fighting against communism or fighting against other problems and issues, and help bring them aid, things like food, bring them goods, bring them things that would help their people. Jackie Kennedy was a vastly popular first lady. She redecorated the White House. Generally, obviously, showed very well on television, just like her husband. Considered, to be an immaculate dresser. I mean, she had the way she dressed. I hope you understood that. It sounded kind of weird. Her and her husband both seemed very refined, very top notch. They were also seen kind of as the ideal family. They had two smaller children. So there was pictures of Caroline Kennedy riding her pony, of little John, so John Jr., JFK Jr., peeking out from the hole underneath his dad's historic desk. In fact, there's a very famous photo of that. They really tried to make the White House classier in the way also that they even welcomed guests. So I say this, and this is one of those things that has enough backing behind it that it probably does seem true. John F. Kennedy, as ideal as this family may have been, it is very possible John F. Kennedy had multiple affairs during his time of being married to Jacqueline Kennedy, possibly even while he was in the White House. Now, I say possible, we don't have a lot of proof of these things. However, there are enough allegations out there, enough historical evidences that it does seem that it's very possible that at least some of it's true. Maybe not all of it, but some of it's true. The most famous of the rumors is obviously that John F. Kennedy possibly had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. Now, as the economy is booming, it made it more intolerable for blacks and how poorly they were being treated. So they did not get equal accommodations in hotels or restaurants, even faced discrimination in jobs and housing. So when you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed, granting end of slavery, granting citizenship, and granting voting rights, you're still here in the 1960s, and many of these things are being denied. And for some of those southern states, we talked about this last year, but the right to vote for many of those who were black in the country were still being nullified, especially in the South, through things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses, like I said, that we talked about last year. President Kennedy's administration asked the Interstate Commerce Commission to ban segregation at lunch counters that were engaged in interstate commerce along the new interstate highways. This would mean if you're traveling across country that they could not segregate or not deny people service at these places. This is important because let's say you're taking a bus trip across country and you stop at some place and it's your only opportunity to eat, and they wouldn't serve you or would serve you at a counter that wasn't for whites, and maybe you wouldn't get as good a service or as good of food. Eventually, the ICC did ban segregation on interstate commerce. One of the reasons they were able to do this so well is because interstate commerce, those are roads owned by the federal government. So if your business is benefiting off of these these interstates, federally government owned roads, then you had to ban segregation in your establishment. Martin Luther King decided to make Birmingham, Alabama, his center for the freedom movement. He called Birmingham the most thoroughly segregated big city in the United States, which is going to prove to be fairly true here. Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor vowed resistance against desegregating Birmingham. It may not sound like that big a deal since he's a police chief, but however, he was also Alabama's Democratic National Committeeman, a man of considerable influence. Rioting broke out in Birmingham the night after Martin Luther King Jr.'s home was hit by a bomb there. Television images of Bull Connor's dogs attacking demonstrators made the city notorious around the world. So dogs were attacking blacks and even maybe some whites who were protesting and rioting against the effort to desegregate Birmingham, Alabama. Alabama's Democratic Governor George Wallace, in his 1963 inaugural address, breathed defiance. This here, I'm going to read a portion of a speech, is his understanding of freedom. I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate, then, that from this cradle of the Confederacy, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generations of forebears done before us. Time and time again through history, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. Wow. This is a elected governor of a state in the United States in 1963 saying segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. What an incredible statement by Governor George Wallace, and such a clear misunderstanding of what freedom really means. Because this was what he said freedom was. Obviously, he even alluded to the Confederacy and Jefferson Davis still clinging on to that past. Governor Wallace did not consider Birmingham residents, taxpayers like Martin Luther King and other blacks to be part of his people, apparently. Wallace pledged that he would stand at the schoolhouse door if they were going to try to desegregate the University of Alabama. So the University of Alabama tried to admit 2 black students, and he literally did stand in the door, trying to keep those students from entering the school. Kennedy had no choice but to send in federal troops. Interestingly, remember, he criticized Eisenhower for using federal troops in Little Rock, Arkansas, when they tried to desegregate the public schools there. But here he has to do the same thing to ensure that these black students can get the education that they deserve. Side note, if you've seen the movie Forrest Gump, this part is in the movie. And, of course, Forrest Gump's there because he's there for a lot of famous situations. So it's kind of funny to see that. But he was there. And at this point in time in the movie, Forrest Gump was playing for the University of Alabama for football. So pretty interesting that part made it in the movie. It's definitely a very famous moment in breaking down segregation in America. Now, blacks in the civil rights movement were frustrated by the slow pace of change. Kennedy had boasted during his campaign that discrimination in housing could be ended by the stroke of a pen. Like basically he could just sign something into law and passed. Black Americans began then sending thousands of to the White House. Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted on countless occasions. He had been stabbed by a deranged black woman, beaten on an airplane flight by an enraged white passenger, and pummeled at a hotel in Selma, Alabama, which was newly integrated. However, he still did peaceful resistance. The president did go on television in June of 1963 to address the nation on civil rights. He said this: "If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public schools available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? We face a moral crisis as a country and as a people. A great change is at hand, and our task is to make that revolution peaceful and constructive for all. Excuse me, real quick, I got to get a drink. Martin Luther King, through all of this, and this is something we mentioned last lecture as well, but through all of this, he emphasized that respect of law was essential. That to incite violence would kind of undermine everything that he and the blacks were fighting for during this time period. So he was well within the American tradition of civil disobedience and protest, and the Christian tradition as well. He obediently accepted jail sentences even when courts found him in violation of the law, and did so in a peaceful manner. So he very much wanted the civil rights movement to have respect for the law. Now, there would be some black leaders that would come along a little bit after this, people like Malcolm X, who at first, Malcolm X towards the end of his life maybe didn't do this, but at first he promoted more violence. Obviously, you have the birth of Black Panthers a few years after this, which promoted more violence as well. So there's going to be some tension there, but the majority of the civil rights leaders during this time period were wanting to do everything they did in as peaceful a manner as possible. Well, they had been promising for a long time a march on Washington, D.C. Now, in 1963, King and other civil rights leaderships were urged hundreds of thousands to come to Washington in August to march on Washington for civil rights. Uh, Organized labor, the AFL-CIO, gave their full endorsement to this march. Hundreds of church leaders and Jewish groups and also joined in this march. Kennedy's reaction was guarded. He was worried that any disorder in such a huge crowd would seize upon Senate opponents to civil rights, so he declined to meet the organizers before the event. So he was kind of worried that if things did go violently, things did turn bad, that this could do more harm than good amongst those members of the Senate who were still for segregation. So he wanted to keep his distance in case things became violent. However, he was very open to the possibility of a meeting in the White House after if things went well. Most white Americans had never heard Martin Luther King speak, and he was a very powerful speaker. So he stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. I am still hoping that we get to go on our trip. We've even discussed it, that we're hoping things open up back up by June, July. Maybe we'll get to go on our youth history trip. And they actually have on the Lincoln Memorial a place where it shows exactly where Martin Luther King Jr. stood to give this speech. In this speech, he asked that his children be judged, quote, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I'm going to read a portion of this speech, and I'll admit it's going to be terrible compared to how well he did it. I encourage you to go online and listen. It is a powerful speech. So rarely can it be said that a speech changed things. This speech literally changed things. It opened the eyes of Americans. It is a truly emotional speech and done so well. And the words are so powerful that it really did change some hearts and minds. So here, this is obviously the most famous part of this speech. I have a dream. I have a dream today. So let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill in Mississippi, from every mountainside. And when this happens, when we allow freedom to ring from every town and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Now, like I said, I encourage you guys to listen. It truly is a great speech. So uh, after this meeting, uh, people dispersed. It was peaceful. They didn't even leave litter behind. It was such an amazing march, done in such a respectful way that Kennedy did invite those who were part of the march, the leaders at least, the civil rights leaders, to the White House after. He did receive praise for this, so he decided, to tie himself to the civil rights movement in a much stronger way by doing this. So, very important moment in U.S. history. Now, this next slide, I'm going to kind of read this. I'm not even going to do details. I want to do this Monday, and we'll do it in a live Zoom meeting. I'll show you some clips maybe from YouTube that I can't really embed into this particular video. But November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy goes to Dallas, Texas. Uh, Part of his campaign, even though the election's not coming up for almost another year, he was just kind of making a trip down to Texas, making sure, hopefully, that he can get Texas on board. There was even some split within the Democrat Party kind of going on in Texas. You have a more liberal part and more conservative part of the Democrat Party, and he kind of wants to bring that together to make sure that they will throw their support behind him. Um, he's riding in an open limousine. Obviously, the top is down. He goes into a place called Dealey Plaza. And shot rings out, and he is killed. Um, Lee Harvey Oswald is then, within hours, um, arrested and said to be the lone gunman. They even do a investigation and say he's a lone gunman. I put up here a conspiracy because I want to talk about that, because I don't believe in a lot of conspiracies. I don't. Most of the conspiracies I hear, I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe people are that ridiculous. But this is a conspiracy that I do believe there is some truth to the fact that I don't think Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. So I want to actually be able to do this live, and I'll tell you guys some stuff, and then maybe you guys can ask me some questions. We will have a test next week, and I will go over that next week too on how that will look. Um, so I'm going to be signing off here. Do have one last question. Last time I asked what your favorite uh, number was, and I've already asked what your favorite movie is, but this time I want to know, what is your favorite TV show of all time? You got to choose one. Um, I used to would have said MASH, and MASH is still top two, but I would probably say The Office is mine. You guys probably are aware of that now, much as I quote The Office and stuff. But you just tell me, what's your favorite TV show of all time? I hope you guys are doing well. Signing off, and we will be getting together soon. So have a great weekend. Bye.